thank all of you guys for coming today. I know it's towards the end of the conference. I actually made a joke yesterday that somehow they always either put me at the very end of the conference or at the very first panel. So again, I truly appreciate everyone coming out today. My name is Katie Glenn, and I am a graduate student at Arizona State University. I'm actually done with classes and finishing my capstone to hopefully graduate in May, and then come this fall, I'll be entering into a PhD program once I decide where. And I am joined in this project and working under the leadership of Dr. Alan Colburn, who is an assistant professor also at ASU. And so the title of this upcoming paper and of our overall project is the normalization of crimmigration framing and news coverage of immigration enforcement. All right, so when we look at these news articles, we're looking at the same two instances, two different stories going on here, but we're looking at a multitude of various framing of these issues going on. So we see keywords that are popping out to really kind of set up the overall tone of these specific articles and things like that. So we see words such as illegal immigrant stay, kill my son, and then also on the same one, killed by a wrong-way driver. So this is important when coming to how the news media frames certain issues, certain topics, certain events. And so just by this whole words matter, like you said earlier, this is what has kind of come forward and what really inspired this project. So this brings us to our research question, which is how is crimmigration framed in news coverage of immigration enforcement? So if you don't know, crimmigration is this newer-ish term that's really the intersection of criminal law and immigration law. And how do these two come together? How does that look in the media, which is what we're studying? How does that look in policy, et cetera? Where is this intersectionality of the two? And so after that, we also want to explore, do crimmigration frames vary across news sources such as different national, and then also amongst various states, and then within the state itself, both on progressive and more restrictive news sources itself. And you've got the Post, you've got the Times, all over the place. So our lit review, so our project actually builds on a very rich scholarship of crimmigration. And so we're looking at different scholarship that's already being done on illegality, crimmigration, immigration, federalism, news framing of immigrants, and borderlands. Now where ours is a little bit different is currently in the scholarship, a lot of the focus is talking about policy. We're talking about the lived experience. And so what we're really doing is we're coupling all of that together to really talk about how. How is it being framed to affect policy, or how is it being framed to affect the lived experience? So for the sake of this particular project, we are focusing solely on two main national news sources, and then also sources within the state of Arizona, mostly because that's where we're at in our initial findings right now. We have tons of other data that we've already downloaded and already gathered. That's where we're at in our analysis of that. So that's really kind of what we're focusing on. And as you can imagine, you gotta have an idea of where you think this project is gonna be going. You're like, okay, yeah, restrictive states, progressive states, et cetera, et cetera. But the interesting thing about this is that we were finding things a little bit different that was kind of counteracting that, which is actually what really sparked more of this, because it was actually going against what we assumed we were going to find. So our data collection. So using this very lovely, small search term, we downloaded tons of articles using 3 separate news databases, ProQuest, Nexus Uni, and Newsbank. And we did a multitude of national, state, and local news sources ranging from 1980 to 2021. And so within these, we ran this to see where all these different search terms came up. So if a news article within that time spread with all these different states, with all these different news sources, showed illegal resident, or DACA, or undocumented, or non-criminal immigrant, criminal alien, et cetera, just to gather as much as possible. Once we gathered that, we then went in, and as you can see, these are the news sources that we're talking about today. We're talking about our Arizona sources, the Post and the Times, Washington Post, Washington Times. We then pared that down to really focus specifically on this one specific area of enforcement. So we ran another search against it to bring in SCOM, or Secure Communities, Customs Enforcement, ICE, and then we actually have these other three that we're going to be running later to showcase things on the border, things on detention, and then also articles on sanctuary. And I should make a note that we had to include the word bird because you would be very surprised at how many bird sanctuary articles there are, as opposed to what we're trying to gather.
Yes.
That being said, as I kind of alluded to, one of the interesting findings that we're seeing is that even though we have two very restrictive, very progressive sources, a lot of the news articles, the numbers are very close to each other with the same relative distribution of readership. So using in vivo, this is how we were building our units of analysis. So again, going through, we within in vivo, within our news articles, we ran another search because we love our searches. So what we did was we wanted to see where the terms crime and immigrant are within a 30-word spread of each other. So now the reason why this, and then all these others as well. The reason why this is important is because not necessarily would we see criminal immigrant being put together in a news article, but within a 30-word spread, it does subconsciously set up that overall tone. And so, as we'll get into later with other findings, maybe the article isn't necessarily saying this immigrant did this crime or is a criminal, but when you're talking about them in relation to each other in the same sentence and the same 30-word spread, it starts to paint a picture, just like what I talked about at the very beginning, about how it already, using certain words and certain key phrases, it already sets it up to kind of make people believe a certain thing, even if it's not directly saying that. So again, this is where we get into these interesting findings. These are all pretty much the exact same, not the exact same, but we're within 600, but that's still much closer to each other and further apart, which is where we started to shift our focus, and we started to realize, is this actually being normalized? Is criminalization of immigrants actually being normalized in the media versus where we would think that based on the source, it would actually not be so much. It would be one particular instance or one particular source or group that's framing it in a certain way. So with this, like I said, we have 10,000 articles just for these particular ones. We have a ton more as well. How did we do it? We did text-based analysis in vivo. So with that, we do have 8 student coders, which was amazing. And I want to point out that throughout this entire project and going forward, we do regular intercoder reliability tests just to make sure we're all on the same page, just to make sure we're all coding the same tone, etc. So what we did was we opened up all the articles. We spread we did a spread coding of it to structure it out to 99 words. So basically the reason why we did this is because, so specifically for this instance, you see the word undocumented immigrants, and then later talks about Tucson being the most dangerous city in America, or in Arizona, for violent crime. You see that, and at first glance you're like, okay, this is clear cut. They're framing it in a certain way, but that would be, that would be dirty for us to do. It's just bad practice for us to leave it at that. So we wanted to open it up and see what's the context surrounding, what's setting this up, what's going forward. We don't want to take it way out of context. So we opened it up, and if it falls into certain nodes, certain categories, we put it into different spots. So again, going back to the snapshot comparison, with the Crimmigration framing, again, like I said, it's very similar. And so it's very disconcerting. But the big thing that is kind of a glimmer of hope is that we are seeing this anti-criminalization framing. We're seeing a good number of it in Washington Post. So yes, they're doing just as much criminalization, but they're also doing some anti-criminalization. So what do I mean by this? What is this Crimmigration that I keep talking about? What is, how am I defining this? So we have, the search term we used was very big, but our coding scheme is even bigger. So what we're doing is, this is one section of our coding scheme where we talk about the binary. So we talk about good immigrant versus bad immigrant. And what does that look like? And what are they saying about that? And so, again, as you can see, these graphs are very similar. These graphs are almost identical. And so, the example I'm going to use in this, so our parent node is talking about the good, bad binary. And then the child nodes then go into, well, what does that mean? So it's when talking about an adult or a child, does that change the narrative? When they're talking about the criminal record, the legal status, cutting in line, etc. How do they paint this picture? How do they paint this binary? So for this one, we're going to talk, So we're talking about the criminal record or the history. So I can get into these later with you guys during the discussion if you want to. But it just gives some examples of how this is being framed. It's talking about illegal immigrants, and then later it talks about the crimes being committed, et cetera, overall. So in both of these examples, they're not talking about one specific instance. They're talking about crime overall and immigrants, relating the two, but also not technically relating the two. So then we go into another one where we talk about this threat narrative that's being presented. And again, with this, it's talking about crime and what is this threat. And so, again, as you can see, so very similar to each other. And here's another one, the word out on the street. If you're in this country illegally and you plan to commit a crime, don't do it in Frederick County. And then just another one where they're talking about the 6 steps of immigration for cracking down on crime. So our counter-crimmigration frames. So this is what the Washington Post is doing to kind of counterbalance that, which is, again, is where we're really seeing this glimmer of hope. And so the big one we're seeing is in the contextual background and where it humanizes immigrants. And so underneath that, I have some examples. These are all from the WPSA. But one of the big ones that we saw a lot of was talking about the family structure of immigrants and talking about, and really humanizing them. And because human beings, heaven forbid, but one of the big ones right here was talking about a person who was detained when he stopped for a cup of coffee when he was on his way to Hopkins to be with his 6-year-old or 7-year-old, 4-year-old, sorry, who was getting treatment for cancer. And so it really starts to say, hey, let's not talk about immigrants as a, this criminal, let's talk about people instead of this overall theme. So we also did network analysis, preemptive, on the codes as they relate to each other. So not just overall, but it's how our codes relate to each other. And so with that, we're seeing this dense, this dense network, which really just kind of speaks further to this concept that this is really being normalized, where they're all really kind of connecting. And so this network analysis is where our codes are within the text, within 2 to 3 paragraphs of each other. So our next steps, like I said, we have a bunch of other states, other articles. Our next big step is after we finish Arizona, we have one more to add to Arizona. Once we finish that, we're going into California. Because if we can find anything that might hopefully counter what our initial findings are, there'll be a glimmer, it'll be California, the most progressive state. But what we're doing with that is California is great because it has multiple regions, it has multiple news sources, it has tons of progressive, tons of restrictive. There's a lot there, and it also has national news sources all around. So that's really where we're going to start to maybe see a difference, and to really see if this is something that can take off, if this is something that is worth exploring in other states. So from that, we want to explore the key differences in the framing. We also want to unpack this network analysis that we did a little bit further. It's going to really help to capture the distinctive patterns. And then we also want to analyze this over time and across areas. So we want to cross-reference these findings on a time scale and see, okay, so where is this influx of this framing coming in? Is this surrounding certain key issues, certain policy changes, elections, things in the media? What's going on here? How can we run that against each other? So I welcome any questions. Like I said, this is in the data gathering and early analysis. So if you have any suggestions, any comments, Any questions? If you're seeing this already, please let me know. I welcome any feedback.